The member for Timiskaming, Cochrane.
Thank you, Speaker. It's always an honour to speak on behalf of the people who live in the riding of Timiskaming, Cochrane, which right now includes the residents of the Wahnapitae First Nation. And I'd like to follow on my colleague from Nickel Belt. And the Wahnapitae First Nation is in a unique position. It's a beautiful, beautiful spot. But quite frankly, it shouldn't be in my riding, because it's almost impossible for those people to be serviced from my riding. I can distinctly remember the first time I visited the Wahnapitae First Nation, and I was quite shocked how far I had to drive around in another riding to actually get there. And
you have to go through Nickel Belt and Sudbury.
yeah, two ridings. You have to go through two ridings. Worse, the people who live in the Wahnapitae First Nation have to drive through two ridings to get to my closest constituency office. That doesn't make sense, Mr. Speaker. So the member from Nickel Belt and myself and Chief Ted Rock, the chief of the Wahnapitae First Nation, who has lobbied long and hard for this change. First time I talked to Chief Rock, that was the first thing on his agenda, because he felt his people would be better serviced if they were actually serviced by the geographical riding they were in. And I would like, that's the most important thing I would like to get across today, that we need an amendment. And this will be our last chance to say this before the hearings, which are going to be very short. Even with the amendment proposed by the Tories, they're still going to be, if it passes, they're still going to be very short. And this is a case, the Wahnapitae First Nation, where the residents agree, both MPPs agree, and actually the riding boundary change would simply, in this case, match the federal riding boundary. So that's an issue. I hope the government is listening, that we are really trying to, make things, actually make government responsive to the Wahnapitae First Nation. It's not an earth-shattering issue for the most of the province, but for the Wahnapitae First Nation would make a big difference. Regarding time allocation, the way it's supposed to work for those people, the way I used to understand government is people were elected, they would have the ability to speak for a certain time. When the members of the House, no one further wanted to speak, the bill would die, or the debate would die a natural death, as happened on Thursday afternoon with Bill 85, I believe. Everyone had spoken. The bill collapsed, and we voted on it this morning. Fairly innocuous procedure. What was funny was after Bill 85 collapsed, I'm the whip of the party, I'm in the whip's office, and the first thing we get is a notice for a time allocation for this bill. So although the process can work, this government chooses not to follow the process. Which is really odd, specifically with the bill where you're talking about electoral boundaries across the province. So this time allocation motion, coupled with the Conservatives, with the Conservative amendment, gives a couple more meeting dates. But let's look at what the government proposed. One afternoon in Toronto to discuss all the riding boundaries and all the electoral concerns from people across the province. Really, Speaker? Maybe, I think Chief Ted Rock is committed enough that we could try and get him on that agenda. But for a lot of people, it's impractical. No, the word is impossible, Speaker, to actually participate in this process. It doesn't have to be done tomorrow. It's not, no one is going to, it's not like a health issue. No one is going to die if we don't get this law in before December. We're talking about our democratic process, which is something very important, and we're talking about issues that are going across the province. An issue that I think this government should take heed of, and although the Premier, I've heard her say several times that we're one Ontario, we are not. There is a huge divide between rural and northern Ontario and urban Ontario, specifically the GTA. Now, instead of taking our differences and making us stronger, because there's nothing wrong, Speaker, with having differences. That's what could make our culture, could make our province very strong. But we have to acknowledge those differences. But an example of how a government talks about, we are one Ontario, but actually in its actions takes a totally different take. Because we're talking about electoral boundaries across the province. We're talking about changing the electoral process across the province. Yet, one afternoon in Toronto, folks, that should be enough for everyone in rural Ontario to express their concerns, which is what is obviously a rural-urban divide. Because people in rural Ontario and Northern Ontario are concerned. They don't begrudge having more seats in the urban part of the province because there's more people. The urban part is growing. No one in rural Ontario begrudges that. But rural Ontario wants to know that they will be represented in this new system where their proportion is less. And you know what? We in rural and Northern Ontario are really nervous about that because specifically an example like this, we're going to change the boundaries, we're going to keep enough seats, we'll keep the same seats in Northern Ontario, and everything's going to be fine, but we're going to have one afternoon of meetings in where? In Toronto, the center of the universe for Ontario. Why do you think people in rural Ontario are nervous? Because if they had we're going to hold hearings where there's enough interest. As when my colleague from Timmins, James Bay, suggested, if they advertise, the committee's about to sit in this bill, and if a lot of people expressed interest from Wahnapitae or from Pewanik or from, and they would make some kind of work something out so these people could actually express their concerns. And perhaps the government could make, guess what, better legislation because they had input from the public. But that's not what this government has chosen to do. It's chosen to fast-track legislation which doesn't need to be fast-tracked. It's chosen to time allocate to stop people from talking on legislation that isn't time-sensitive, but it is regionally sensitive. It's very sensitive, and the government has chosen it hasn't by happenstance, this isn't by accident. This government has chosen to ignore Northern Ontario. It's chosen to ignore rural Ontario. There is a huge rural-urban divide. It's created by this government and perpetuated by this government, and it needs to stop. And that's why this time allocation motion is absolutely disastrous for the province. Thank you, Speaker.